Hi, I'm Kat.
I'm Arden 13.
Welcome to our show, World Tiger.
Building Dragon.
After our adventures with the World Anvil Summer Camp project, Arden and I wanted to continue our world building web series with a couple variations. We wanted to show you, our friends at the lunch table, how you can build your own worlds such as Theatrum and Ellicrid.
Neither Kat nor I are experts in this field. However, we do have some personal experience to draw off of, as well as a wealth of inspirations from famous authors and settings that we've come to know and familiarize ourselves with over the years, from Middle-earth to the Star Wars franchise, from Pan Am all the way to the world of Ice and Fire.
In this first leg of this journey, we wanted to show you the basics of world building, how and where to even start, building your own histories and myths, creating your own maps, as well as figuring out the races and geography of your world.
But before we get to all of that, today we're just going to start with the whys of world building. Why are you world building? And kind of starting to breach into the wheres to start.
There's a lot to discuss, so let's get started.
Let's do this. Kat?
So, for today's episode, we're just going to be talking about the basics of world building, more specifically, why even world build? Why take on this crazy task?
This monumentous hobby.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the bigger things is why world build, but why are you creating this world? I think once you have a direction for your world building, it makes things a whole lot easier. Why does this world even begin to exist for you? Are you writing it for a book? Are you writing it for a game?
Are you writing it for a movie? Are you writing it for fun?
For fun. That is one of the greatest reasons to world build, is just for fun.
Just for fun.
Mm-hmm.
So really, that should be the first question that needs to be answered in terms of trying to figure out not even where to start world building, but why are you world building?
Mm-hmm.
And if it is literally just for fun, there is nothing wrong with that, and you should enjoy every second of it. If it is for a book or a movie, cool. Like that, there are.
I think that provides a really unique setting, because as for like writing for an RPG game or maybe just for fun, you can just keep writing and writing and writing, and you can flesh out an entire world just for fun. But if you're doing it for a book or for a show, the things that you have to world build specifically change. You really only have to world build what's going to be affected in the story.
Sure. There was an author that said something, I read an article not too long ago. The author basically said the world building should not be showy to the point where it is overbearing on the plot itself. It should establish rules, and the rules, everything else that comes in the world building should follow those rules. But at the same time, he kind of compared it to the way that a video game would be, where the character is walking into an area and the world would generate only what the character can interact with at the time.
Yeah, right.
And that's essentially, if you're writing for a book or a movie, that's the breadth of the world building you should do. Obviously, everything that you build should follow the rules that you set forward. However, it should not be so showy to the point where it overshadows the actual story that you were trying to convey, especially in a book and especially in a movie.
I think another one of the important questions to ask when you're world building is, what are you hoping to accomplish with this world? Again, if you're doing it just for fun, you can do it just for fun, and what you're hoping to accomplish is just creating a fully fleshed out world that you can call your own. If you're looking to write a book or a movie or whatever, if what you're hoping to accomplish is that the world itself gives that breath, gives that life to the story, without just having a, I don't want to call it a bland background, but just something that's stagnant in the background, and instead it kind of gives meaning to the story a little bit more.
To build off of that, I think it also really, when it comes to a book and a movie, the world building that you are doing is setting the tone and the themes and kind of the stuff that you constantly talk about in your world building, the reoccurring, like, tropes that you will see in the book and in the movie. All the things that you should note in the world building should feed the movie and feed the story that you are trying to convey. Whereas if you are building a world for a gaming system, you can pretty much throw whatever you want to.
Do whatever you want.
Do whatever you want, because all of this, it's help me out here, because to me, if I'm world building for an RPG, I'm more or less building a sandbox.
Right.
But when I'm building for a book, I'm trying to build a foundation for the story that is being told. Similar to the way that George Orwell wrote 1984, which is world building. It's an alternate history world building, but literally all of the world building, all of the culture and the society that Winston lives in 1984 is setting the tone and the precedence for what the story is going to surround in a way.
And I think that knowing what story you're hoping to tell helps with that too. I think kind of what you were talking about with setting that tone, setting that almost that background noise of like what are your characters going through, what are they hearing, what are they seeing, that's aiding in that journey that they're going through when they're going through a book or a show. And I really like your idea with the writing or creating your own world for an RPG game or anything like that. You have that sandbox because you're not in control of those characters. They're going to kind of do whatever they want, versus with a book or a show, you have a lot more control of what the audience will see and do. With an RPG game, you're just kind of saying, have fun!
Have fun!
It's a world, go explore.
Go
and
do
see
things.
I mean, there are storylines that you can throw in there, but for the most part, it's
and
just...
limitations, sure.
Most of the time, it's just... It can be very free reign and just have fun, see what I've built for you!
Right. Whereas world building for fun is the idea of you're not building a foundation, you're not building a sandbox, you're creating for the sake of creation. And that in and of itself is a very rewarding experience, I would say.
Right.
Just for funsies.
I guess last question would be how or why, the first question is why did you create Ellicrid?
Why did I create Ellicrid? I created Ellicrid because I had been playing tabletop role-playing games for quite some time, probably the better part of my life, and when I started playing tabletop RPGs with my close circle of friends, I needed a place in which they could play their games and I could tell my stories. Now, I have nothing against the Forgotten Realms, or Eberron, or Greyhawk, or any of the established settings in D&D. I just have this weird thing where I don't like messing with other people's lore.
Right.
And I like to tell very grandiose stories, those like ancient Greek epics that can shake the foundations of the world. And you can't really do that in somebody's established world. So I made Ellicrid for myself to tell these lofty stories, but also for my players to play in these lofty stories and be able to shake the foundations.
Be able to change things without worrying like, well, that doesn't really fit in the canon of the Forgotten Realms, or
right. So that's why I made Ellicrid, for my players to run around and be hooligans. Why did you make Theatrum?
I kind of the same thing, except I really love telling stories, but the main issue that I would run into with a lot of my stories is I would run into the issue of the world building and I would start small and I'd start off with these, characters or maybe just a scene that I really liked, and I would start to build out and I would realize like I can't put them. It was almost like they were in limbo, like they didn't have anywhere else to go. They were just kind of there. So I created Theatrum for a place where I could just create my own stories, write whatever I wanted, and it's my world. So again, like, it's not shaking the foundations of anything. It's not drastically changing any other system or any other world because it's mine, and what I say goes. But I also, if I wanted to run an RPG game or if I wanted to write a book or something like that, I wanted Theatrum to be a place where it's like, I've created everything here, so no one can say, well, that's not how that actually works, because it's mine.
I say what goes. I say what
goes.
Actually works.
So going from why did you create your own world, I think an important part is to go, where now do you start? Where did your world come from?
Seems like a logical transition.
Yeah, I think one of the important things when you start world building is figuring out, are you going to start from scratch by building your own world like Theatrum and Ellicrid, or are you going to use an alternate timeline? Now, alternate timelines can be a lot of fun.
So much fun.
I think one of my favorite think one of my childhood favorite versions of an alternate timeline would just be anything from the Percy Jackson series, where it's like, it's just Earth, except Greek gods are still around, and Roman gods are still, like, all those mythologies are still around.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really good version of an alternate timeline. It's just, what if... I think that the important thing with alternate timelines is answering the question, what if?
What if, for sure.
What if the Greek gods were still around?
My favorite alternate timeline, if we're talking about alternate timelines first and foremost, would be... Good lord. Did I suddenly get dust in my eye? We'll see you in a second. Yeah. Anyway, I think one of my favorite versions of an alternate timeline is... either the Shadowrun universe or the SCP Foundation. Those are just super fun and kind of weird. It's not like answering the question like, what if this happened, or what if like this world event happened differently. It's more or less, well, to be frankly honest, the Marvel and the DC universe is great examples of alternate timelines.
Oh yeah.
It's just Earth, but they're asking the question of what if they were superheroes? What if there were mutants? What if there were all these different things? Otherwise, Shadowrun and the SCP Foundation is like pretty generally just the normal timeline, but of course the Shadowrun universe has the Awakening when magic returns, but the SCP Foundation is like, while history has been moving at a steady pace, these weird things have been happening, and the Foundation has been organized to basically deal with them. Take care of that.
Yeah. Alternate timelines is a really good place to start, and it's I don't want to call it easier, because it's not. But if you're starting out world building, or if you're starting with writing, or just creating a book or a movie in general, alternate timelines, I feel like, simplify things just a little bit, because to a certain point everything in history stays the same until a certain point.
Until a certain point when something drastically changes.
Versus if you're starting from scratch, you have to create, you don't have to do anything, but there's this idea that you kind of, if you start from scratch, you start from the world of, where did your world come from? Where did your world come from? Was it just, Stardust, or where, like it just...
If you start from scratch, you're definitely taking on a larger beast than an alternate timeline. But to be frankly honest, there should be no discrepancies between, I'm starting my world from scratch, or I'm taking an alternate timeline, because to be frankly honest, both of them have their merits, because the world is going to react differently to an event happening.
Right.
Like, the ending to World War II, if it had not ended the way that it did, we would be looking at a very different 21st century. And the same thing with, one of my favorites was when I was younger and I was studying Greek history and Greek mythology, because that's what I did when I was 7 years old. I learned about the Battle of Thermopylae, which has been stylized and put to film in the movie 300. But what would have happened if the Persians had won that war? The world would be very, very different.
Right.
And that's just, those are the different moments in the alternate timelines that make things interesting.
Right. And I think talking about starting a world from scratch, I think something that's important when you're starting your own world building is maybe not creating a full world to begin with, because in order to world build, you don't have to start with, and then the stars and the moons and the suns. You can
world building. I think we should preface, world building, when we say world building, we're not specifically talking about taking a globe and building the world. Like, absolutely correct. We had a conversation with a good friend of ours not too long ago talking about how he was interested in starting to world build, but he didn't think he had an idea for, like, a world, maybe just like an alternate timeline. That's world building. Right. That is still world building.
You are just creating something within a world that would be different, or not what actually happened in history. I think something that when I started with Theatrum, that definitely tripped me up a couple times, because I started off with, I'm going to create a world, I'm going to start with the tectonic plates and create a continent out of that, and there were a couple months after that where I was like, I don't think I can do this, and I would like pack all my notebooks and set them aside, and then I'd wait a month and come back to it and be like, oh god, oh my god, like here we go.
Here we go
and
again.
like, and I'm still, you know, definitely still sometimes I'm looking at the continent of Theatrum, I'm like, it's not that big. I have one continent on this planet, and still sometimes
nice.
I look, I know, and still sometimes I look at it and I'm like, there's too much to build, there's too much. So I think starting small and growing can be a really good way to start world building.
Mm-hmm.
So
whether or not you're taking an alternate timeline or starting from scratch, because you don't have to start from and then there was light.
Mm-mm.
For sure you don't have to do that. That is something that you, if you are starting from scratch, inevitably, unless the origins of your world are just negligible or misunderstood or otherwise, you can literally... when I started building Elicrid, the first thing that I built was Ravensport. The city, the town... it was a town, the town of Ravensport. And, like, one of the initial modules or quests or missions that I ran with my players was, like, a dispute between two rival gang factions in Ravensport. And because of the way that they played it, one gang took power and turned it from like a little like no-name town on the road to like a thriving metropolis. And from there Ravensport was like became a thing, became a staple, and then I kind of then I drew the world map and then just it spiraled out of control.
I find it really interesting because even from the World Anvil project, I could tell that your style of world building is almost like start big and then build in, but when you originally started with Elicrid, you started with just a town and then moved out, versus my world building, I feel like, is I'm going to focus on the tiny itty-bitty details and then branch out.
This
plant, and then branch out. But when I started creating Theatrum, I started with the gods and the tectonic plates. I don't know, I just think that's funny.
No, it's
just like...
it's interesting how... when you start world building, whether it is an alternate history or starting from scratch, it's very interesting to see how you as a world builder develops. Because, yes, for you, when you first started with Theatrum, you started big and went down small, but now when you hit something, you have to start with the smallest thing and build out, but you've built yourself that framework. Whereas I started small with this little town and then threw my net out to make the larger world, and now I start from, you know, put the map up, throw a dart at it, alright, we're gonna be in this location, let's build it down from there. And that's just, there's no right or wrong way to world build, and I think that should be stated.
So going off of where did your world come from, just getting the very basics of your world, where do you go from there? Now you kind of have a basic idea of your world. Now what?
Now and I think you started with the gods. I started with a town. Where do you go from there?
Right. And I think one really important thing about world building is writing stuff that you enjoy and finding inspirations, using your own inspirations to get you started. So for me, I love mythologies and histories and learning about Greek, Roman gods, Egyptian gods, like all of that stuff. That's stuff that I find really interesting, which is why I started with the gods. I looked up a ton of different mythologies, and I wrote out I have a piece of paper that's just like, what are the common themes that I can find throughout all of these gods, throughout all of these older religions and mythologies. You know, they always have a god of love. They always have a god of, you know, the sky and storms. They always have a god of the sea, and just listing all of this out and figuring out, like, okay, what gods do I need to have in Theatrum that makes sense based on all of these other mythologies that existed. That's kind of where I started, because that's one of my passions, and finding inspirations from all of those stories, all of those, you know, older mythologies to help craft my pantheon, I guess, and that's kind of where I started with that.
For me, finding where to start, the things that I enjoyed, I more or less drew on inspirations from books that I had read when I was younger. I grew up on The Lord of the Rings. I was reading that in 6th grade when everyone else was reading because of Winn-Dixie.
Mm-hmm.
But I grew up on The Lord of the Rings, I grew up on The Inheritance Cycle, all these different things, these fantasy books, these fantasy tropes that I was so heavily ingrained in my head, coupled with my love of mythology and the hero and the hero's journey and the lofty aspirations, these things that shake the foundations of the world, is kind of where I started. From like humble beginnings, Aunt May or Aunt Peru and Uncle Owen getting killed by stormtroopers, all the way to defeating the evil empire.
Right. I think finding your own inspirations and knowing where to and how to draw from those to world build is super important. For this, I looked up a couple of like famous-ish authors.
Sure.
Famous-ish. They're famous authors.
Famous-ish.
Famous-ish.
I'm looking at the list right now.
Have you ever heard the Hunger Games?
Have you
that?
ever heard of these people? What?
No, they are definitely famous for good reason, and figuring out what inspired them to write their own worlds, because that's another thing that you can look up is what inspired George R.R. Martin to write and just make...
Why does A Song of Ice and Fire exist? Why does The Lord of the Rings exist? Why does The Hunger Games exist? Why does any of these stories exist? Why does the worlds or any of these stories exist?
I think that the one that I found really interesting, because I recently read, it is a song of Songbirds and Snakes, I think, by Susan Collins. It's the prequel to the Hunger Games series, so I'm kind of on a Hunger Games thing right now. But she got really inspired by the Greek myth of Theseus for the reaping, where children would be taken from their homes and given to the... Minotaur, yes. I was trying to figure out the maze thing.
The labyrinth.
There we go. Yes. That's where she got that.
I got your back.
Thank you. But she also was really inspired by... I remember reading an article about her, an interview, where she said that she was sitting there watching TV, and on one channel there was like this reality TV show about, two people talking about each other, whatever, reality TV, and then she flipped the channel and it was all about this, and I forget what war, but it was something terrible was going on the other side of the globe, and just being able to switch between the two channels and see like...
Channels back to back,
right.
Not like channels in between
no,
each other.
No, it was just
back to
you
back.
can see these, very Hunger Games-esque, where, you've got these people that are bickering over nothing, and then there are people starving and getting hurt and, like, these awful things on these two channels back to back, and that's what really inspired her to write The Hunger Games. And she was also inspired as far as, like, the 13 districts. She used inspiration from the 13 colonies, and so she definitely drew a lot of inspiration just from what she knew, and she talked about loving Greek mytho-history and all that fun stuff, so she threw that in there. But I thought that was really cool, just being able to look at the world around you and be like, one, I don't like that, and two, really being able to show people through your own writing, like, this is not right, this isn't okay, like being able to just flip in between the two.
I thought that was very well done. I recall seeing The Hunger Games before I read The Hunger Games, and one of the things that made me the most uncomfortable is when I was watching The Hunger Games for the first time, and when the first horn goes off.
Oh yeah.
And the Hunger Games begin for the first time, when we see that, and they cut out all the audio, and all we see is this silent carnage. And I remember being so uncomfortable sitting there watching that and going, this is incredibly Roman of us.
Yeah.
This is very,
yeah.
This is very, like, I'm brought back to, like, times in ancient Rome when we would watch the gladiators fight each other and, like, spill blood, and it was gory, and everyone was, like, screaming and losing their minds, like, yeah, kill him! And it's like, this is a bit
much. But, yeah, so
but that is an inspiration in and of itself, for sure. For sure. So, another more modern author that I had the privilege of looking through a couple articles, just researching stuff for this as well. But I really connected with it because one of their major inspirations, I'm talking about Lev Grossman, who is the author of the Magician's Trilogy. And one of Lev's greatest inspirations was Narnia. And they said there were two quotes that I really enjoyed of Lev's, and the first one was basically having to do with when you say that a world has elves and dwarves in them, then we as a society already know that in this world there are deep sylvan forests with tall, good-looking people in it, and that there are mountains with deep mines and sturdy, bearded dwarves. We already know that. We don't have to do any other world building besides saying there are elves and dwarves that exist, and people already make that connection.
Right.
But then Lev went on to talk about C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia series, and basically he was like, I wanted to take Narnia and do it better. And the thing is that he loves trying to like talk from his perspective, but also like mine. Basically, Lev loves the Chronicles of Narnia. However, C.S. Lewis was a little bit of a lazy and sloppy world builder. And that was in the fact that it was like, if he wanted to throw in fauns from Greek mythology, he threw in fauns from Greek mythology. And then he decided, oh, by the way, there's also Santa Claus. Right. It's like, none of this really makes any sense. They are clearly, another thing that he says is that they were clearly in a very medieval, underdeveloped sort of, not primal, but a very medieval technology base, but Mrs. Beaver has a sewing machine. Which is very Victorian.
I didn't think about that.
Yeah, no, I didn't think about that either. And it's like, that is world building, but that is just a little bit sloppy because it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense.
Who gave the beavers technology?
Who gave the beavers technology, and why do they not rule Narnia? These are all questions.
Yes.
But I really connected with that, A, because I love Narnia myself, B, I had never really noticed that, and I did think it was kind of weird that Santa Claus is in Narnia, but I kind of got over that. But at the same time, my understanding of C.S. Lewis is that his creation of Narnia, not only the world, but the story itself, was him working through his faith. Working through what he believed in terms of a religious background for him. So that was something that I connected with, and I think just Lev's comments took that to a whole new height of hysteria for myself. I thought that was great.
Right. I'm going through again with some of our, maybe favorite authors and figuring out where they started or kind of what inspired them to start. I mentioned earlier, George R.R. Martin, he literally just kind of created Game of Thrones, like the basics of it, over a summer. He was just like, I'm gonna write a short story about this lovely little family finding some direwolf puppies. And then...
Are you serious?
Yes. He was just like, direwolf puppies for everybody, including this bastard kid. And that was it. And then he, from there, built it out.
That's literally like the first part of the first book.
He said the first chapter of Game of Thrones came to him out of nowhere, and he just started writing.
Wow.
And then from there he started creating these families, and obviously he was inspired by 100 Years War. Right? There we go. Yeah, that was the right one. My brain just went
I do not know enough about the 100 Years War to articulate any of the details, but I did.
There are other YouTube videos out there that can do that for you. That is not this.
But I do recall him. I do recall the note being made about the 100 Years War being a direct allusion in A Song of Ice and Fire.
Right, but it didn't start with that. He didn't say like, I'm going to take this 100 Years War and make it different. It was, I want everyone to have direwolf puppies, and now everyone's dead. Like, that's where it came from. Like,
direwolf puppies.
Like,
oh my gosh.
It took, I think another quote that I read from him was it took him a half hour to write the map, to draw the map, which makes me angry, but that's fine. Because it takes me forever to draw a map, but I guess when you can just kind of...
When it comes to you, it comes to you. And I think this is a good moment that I would like to add in other points of inspiration. We've got a couple more authors that we want to talk about. Yes, Tolkien. But also, like, some worlds come about for very simplistic reasons. Like, you don't have to have, like, these lofty goals. They can just literally come into your brain through writing a short story. I know you wanted to talk about Shubkowski here in a second. But the most minimal things can give you the inspiration to create a world.
Right.
I want to talk about Tolkien for a second, because my understanding of Tolkien, and I found this out after I had read the trilogy, I had read The Hobbit, and I was working my way through the Silmarillion, and I was informed. I knew that he was a linguist. I knew that was his profession, that was what his degrees were in, but he had, essentially what had happened is that Tolkien had written 2 to 3 languages. The Elvish tongue, Quenya and Sindarin, and then a Dwarven dialect. And I'm not talking about, like, he had some words scribbled down, and, he made languages. He created languages with, like, declensions, conjugations, tenses, like, subjunctives, everything. And that blew my mind.
Yes.
But why he created The Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth was, he felt so nerdy about it that he had to give them legitimacy in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
And I know we had once talked about in the movie that came out not too long ago.
The movie, I think it was just called Tolkien.
Tolkien, sure. He was on a date with somebody.
Yeah, that was one of the best parts. For me, that was one of the best parts of the movie, because, and I didn't actually do research to see if this was a real thing, but basically he went on a date with a nice young lady, and he was talking to her in Elvish and was wooing her, and she asked him, like, well, what does that mean? And he told her, and she goes, well, what story is it from? Like, where did these words come from? And he was just like, and she's like, words, he's like, I just made them up, it means nothing. And she's like, no, the only reason that language has meaning is because it has something behind it. It has a story, it has an origin, it has meaning because of what we're saying. And so, I don't know if that's accurate or if that actually happened, but that in the movie is what prompted him to actually start creating and giving his language more meaning through these stories and through this world. Yeah.
I think it's incredible to start writing a book series, much less creating a world, off of the fact that you already made 3 languages.
Yeah, Tolkien's he do his own thing.
He do his own thing.
He can have fun.
He's the god. He's the godfather of fantasy writing. He can do whatever he wants.
I think one of my favorite origins for this isn't really an inspiration based, but kind of, or just where this author started would be on Andrzej Sapkowski. He's the author for the Witcher series, and he just entered a 30-page writing contest in Poland, and he basically wanted to take this Polish fairy tale about a cobbler who defeats a dragon because he feeds the dragon, like, sulfur, I think.
He feeds it sulfur, yeah.
And then dragon goes to drink water and
explode.
Pop goes the dragon. And so, my favorite line from Sapkowski, so sorry, my favorite quote from that article was him being like, "This is a lie. Poor cobblers make good shoes, they don't kill monsters. Soldiers and knights, they're idiots in general. Priests only want money and other things." And he's like, so who's actually killing monsters? Professionals. You don't call poor cobblers apprentices, you call for professionals. So then I created the professional. He just wanted to create a professional monster killer.
Hunter, yeah.
And that's what he did. I also found that it was really interesting. He published, so I think he got 2nd place for that writing contest because it was fairy tale based. And I think at the time, Polish fairy tales were seen as kind of like why would you write a fairy tale? Like, it was kind of like, it was like, good job, but that's still weird. He published his first novel in 1993, and the last official book in the series in 1999. And somehow he and George Martin are still friends. I don't know how that works. But that's
and
fine.
George still hasn't put out the last 2 books.
We don't need to talk about that. We don't need to talk about George.
But I have heard that George has been making great strides over quarantine. He's writing both of the books in tandem with each other.
I don't know how you do that.
I don't know
but I
either.
guess we'll find out.
We'll find out. I'm looking forward to it, whatever happens.
More inspirations or other, I guess, answering the why do you this is more why you write versus why you world build, but both John Flanagan, who is the author of the Ranger's Apprentice series, and then Rick Riordan, who's the author of the Percy Jackson series, both of them wrote series for their sons. They wrote their books for their kids. George Flanagan, his son, was smaller compared to his other friends and had issues keeping up, and so John Flanagan wrote The Ranger's Apprentice as a, you know, you can still be the hero even though you're smaller. It just means you have to be craftier and, you know, have to be faster than the others.
More cunning.
More cunning.
Crafty
right.
and cunning.
Right, and then I read through that article, and it turns out John Flanagan's son grew up to be like 6 feet tall and super muscular, and he was just, but he still enjoys reading the books.
Good.
It was just like, yay. And then Rick Riordan, his son, had dyslexia, and so Rick Riordan wrote Percy Jackson to have dyslexia and kind of have those inspirations for writing. You know, you're writing for yourself, but you're also writing and creating for other people, which I think is really honorable.
I agree with that. And in that same vein, we talk about we've talked about writers specifically, but also for game designers and game masters.
Mm-hmm.
The creator of the Forgotten Realms, Gary Gygax, and D&D specifically, he created that world basically so his friends had a place to tell their stories, to create their own worlds and create their own things. The Forgotten Realms are essentially, like, that's the shorthand version of it. It's really just the Forgotten Realms of Gary Gygax and his pals. Like, that's what that is. And I think that's really cool because all of these creatures that are so, like, iconic for D&D, like the Beholder, are creations that he and his friends came up with. Like, just hanging out and, you know, playing D&D. They're like, oh, what if there was a monster that had one big eyeball, a floating big eyeball.
Them all sitting around the table next to a whiteboard, and they're all like, everybody's drinking a beer, and it's like, add another eyeball, like.
Oh, no, wait. Put it on an eye stalk. Like, oh, no. Add 4 more. Just do it. Just do it.
Trust me.
And then all these different things have come about that. In the same way, the creator of Eberron, whose name is escaping me at the moment, and I apologize, created Eberron because they wanted a game setting, they wanted a setting where they could play D&D, but it was more like steampunky Wild West. And Eberron plays a lot more about the intrigue. It's more, there's a lot more conversational conflict that's going on in Eberron, a lot more shadowy games that's going on. As opposed to regular, you know, standard Forgotten Realms D&D, but that was why Eberron was created. It was to take a spin on something that already existed and have fun with that.
Yeah. I think wrapping up this whole section about authors and their inspirations, where they started, why they started all these things, I wanted to ask you, what really inspired you to start world building? You started world building because you wanted to, you know, have a place for your characters and your friends to kind of just
do
shenanigans.
Sure. I guess in that realm I was very similar to Gary Gygax, but for me, world building was something that I started doing more or less because I've been writing short stories for years. I've been drawing characters for years, and they had no home. They had no place of belonging. But in terms of world building, no matter what world it is, because I'm a glutton for punishment and I just make worlds sometimes, they have a home. These stories can all exist somewhere in one of these worlds. It's all to tell a story. And for you?
Funny enough, I was actually, so the first D&D campaign that I played in was actually in Ellicrid, and I think figuring out, it was like, wait a minute, you just made this for fun? This is what you do? Like, you just create things? I was like, that's awesome, I want to do that. So I was really inspired by Ellicrid and figuring out, like, oh, you don't have to, like, create a whole world just for a book. You can just do it for fun. But yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Kat, let's cover the main points from today's episode.
We did cover a lot. So to begin with, I think the first thing you should consider when world building is figuring out why. Why are you starting to world build to begin with? Is it for your own books? Is it for fun? Is it for maybe writing for your own RPG game setting? Figuring out why, because that will give you a good direction on where to go from there.
The next thing that you'll need to discover or decide is whether or not you are starting from scratch or using an alternate timeline. Either of these are perfectly fine. They just add something new and different, and a little bit of difficulty, depending on what it is, to your world building. But basically anything goes. There is nothing wrong with either of those choices.
Another main point would be finding your own inspirations, engaging your own interests. If you're not interested in something, why spend time doing it? So find something that inspires you. That could be another author, a person, a place, an event in history, and use that to feed that world building fire.
Nice callback.
I know.
And the last thing is more or less a recommendation. There are so many different ways and places to start, but a recommendation that we have so you don't easily overwhelm yourself, because that is constantly something that happens, is start small. Start small and then start to build your way out larger, or cast your net out so broad that you can start to narrow yourself down.
Right.
It's always good to start small and then work your way out, or start so large that you are able to like easily compartmentalize your issues. Another recommendation that I also have for anyone who wants to take the option of the alternate timelines is ask yourself the question, what if?
That will give you a great sense of direction, where to go, how to keep going. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Let us know in the comments below something you enjoyed about today's video, or answer the question for us, why did you start world building and where did you start? Or what's your favorite setting?
If you enjoyed today's video, please make sure to hit all those buttons that everyone else bugs you about. We would love for you to join our lunch table.
And keep a lookout for our next video where we will be getting into the nitty-gritty details of where to start world building.
Alrighty, lunch buddies, I'm Kat.
I'm Arden 13. I'm still waiting on that ramen.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.